Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Asghari, and today I'm honored to have a very special guest, Mr. Erik Andersen. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Andersen, first of all, I'd like to apologize for the technical difficulties I have put you through.
No, 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 no.
It's a testament to your patience that you're still here. Uh, I thought maybe just to get started, if you could tell the audience briefly a little about yourself.
Well, after being RCF pilot in Europe for a while, I went back to a university, and the federal government, in their wisdom, dubbed me an economist. I don't know if that was a mistake they regretted later or not, but anyway. Um, And so I practiced as an economist with the federal government in transportation. Specifically, I was in the transportation research group for a while, air transport committee for a while. And then I decided I'd like to do something with a little more hands-on instead of so much words, and I wanted it close to action. So I won a job as the chief of airport planning in the Pacific region in Vancouver. And that was fun. And then an acquaintance, sort of friend of mine, Don Watson at Pacific Western Airlines, recruited me to come and join the airline as one of their economists. And that was fun. Um, Went through a lot of ups and downs in that, looked at buying new airplanes. That was a lot of fun. Spent time down in Seattle with Boeing, and went over to a few air shows in Paris, and that was all of that was fun. But I crossed swords with the chief executive officer in PWA at one point, and he really didn't like me after that. So I ended up doing something else. Uh, that brought me to one point where I thought, oh, I'd answer an advert for an economist at International Civil Aviation Organization. And of course, I had a lot of supporters, so that helped. And I went there as chief of the economics for 1 year. They didn't want me to stay longer. And the reason for that was that I was of a belief that the job of an economist was to speak truth to power. And that meant when I was looking at the international air travel opportunities to and from South America, mostly, and the Caribbean and Central America, the thing that stood out for me was the extreme division of unfairness of how the gross domestic product in those countries were divided. So, just to put the practical term on it, it meant that only a few people in that country, in those countries, could afford international travel. And as much as they might want to, they had to have the money to buy the air tickets and go abroad. So that stood as a big obstacle to an objective of the UN, was to get people together, and from getting them together, they would learn how to speak civilly to each other and not go and do things like war. Um, I wrote a chapter on my report, and it was deleted. So it quickly wasn't made quickly aware to me that the the operation was a political one. They didn't want to have that knowledge in a report that I would have to sign, because then they couldn't say they didn't know. So I decided I wasn't invited to stay. Well, I was. They wanted me to go off and be their representative, the UN representative in Beirut, of all places, at the time when war was going on. I said, no, I didn't think that was a good idea. I couldn't take my family there. So we parted, and that was the end of my wanting to be a professional economist. After that, I took on the job of being advisor to individuals on investments. And that proved interesting. At at the time of the that I joined up in that industry, the principal investment uh, advisors were independent, and so there was a commercial and operational difference between the bank system and the investment advisor system. And that was mirrored on what it was like in the United States. The reasoning for that originally was that there would be conflicts of interest if it was blended. But that didn't stop Canada. The banks wanted to own the investment advisors. And so they went ahead and they bought them out. And I had one particular occasion to go to a business meeting in Toronto. And I walked into this gathering, and the first person to accost me was the head of the sales, the national sales program, a guy by the name of Wally Gabler, who was a football player, recruited to be an investment guy. And he had heard that I had refused to sell a particular income trust that was based on real estate at the time. And he put the requirements of the firm to sell ahead of the requirements of my reasoning in defense of my clients and their interests. So Wally told me to my face there and then he would fire me if I wasn't going to play by his rule book. And I said, oh, I'll play by your rule book, all right. I went home to Vancouver and I resigned and switched firms. And they could never understand it. Anyway, that was the first inkling I had of problems in that industry, which is the financial sector. But in 1998, the wreckage was there in various ways to see. And I prepared a presentation to the superintendent of financial institutions in Canada. You wouldn't believe there is one, but there is. And in it, I presented evidence that the brokerage industry was now exploiting their power to escape accountability for what they did, the banks did in the way of loans, by transferring them into packages of income trusts. And I gave the superintendent about 6 examples, 6 or 7, I think. And the indication was basically that they had issued at one price and say 1 or 2 years later, the quoted price on the stock market was about 40% below. So they had deliberately shifted their riskier loans into the hands of unsuspecting investors and probably pension plans. So that letter was prompted by the rumor, not backed up by any evidence that I had, that the six major banks in Canada were going to combine into three, which is concentration of power even further. And I said, on the strength of the evidence, why would you ever allow that? And at the time, the finance minister was Paul Martin. And he was gracious enough to send me a letter of thank you. And that was very nice to get. But more importantly, the idea of six becoming three ended right there, stopped. So we have six today. But that process is it never stops. There's always more along the same lines. So it's a nonstop battle to suppress this business of concentration of power, financial power mostly. So now we come to the issue of debt, eh? And we come to the issue of what the finance minister in British Columbia just announced, and they're having a discussion with all parties about the deficit. Well, from the work that I had done in regard to South Africa, or not South Africa, South America, and what I told you about in Canada, um, you tend to then always be alert to the health of the economy, the general financial health of the economy. And one of the people who wrote about that was John Perkins and his experience of deliberately overloading countries in various parts of the world with debt. The purpose behind that was to have them beholden to the issuer of the debt. They remove some of their ability to function as an independent sovereign country. And to say it was accidental, no, it was deliberate. John makes a strong case all along in various parts of the world of that whole point. So loss of sovereignty and then getting financial help to make you through the night kind of thing usually means you have to trade off something. If you don't have the money, you trade off something, and usually it's ownership of assets. So in the case of British Columbia now, they claim they have a $9 billion hole in their budget with more to come. There will probably or possibly be some quid pro quo, just like when you go to get a mortgage, you have to sign off as having the property as the security for the loan. So you just take that out from being a house loan to being a loan on the assets of the province. That is the part that's been worrying me because that means that my children and grandchildren have a handicap going into the future that they shouldn't have. And it comes from being from there being a willingness to borrow more and more and spend more and more that you really can't afford. Now, in terms of Canada and British Columbia, we have made an economy out of being producers of basic commodities. And that's fine as long as the commodities are always there, but they usually have a habit, especially in the case of mining and oil and gas, they have a habit of running out. There's a limitation. Uh, and so it's all good as long as there's gold in those mines, you happily spend. But when the gold runs out, you have to start cutting back on your spending and start thinking about how you're going to save instead of spend. The worrisome issue then is what are we committing as support for our financing and our lending. In the case of BC, a big user of other people's money has been BC Hydro. They have for quite a few years now been awarding contracts to people who want to generate electricity, then sell to BC Hydro at a price that they will not be bankrupt. In fact, they will make a lot of money. And of course, the owners of BC Hydro are the people of the province. Now, I don't know what the balance is in terms of official debt at BC Hydro and contractual obligations to these producers, but it's significant. It's very significant. Now, the reason why I use those terms, those two terms, is that when I've talked to members of the legislature about the budget and about finances, they're generally okay talking about what's called debt. It's a formal term. But they don't really know or don't want to know or don't want to talk about what might be then called other debt under the heading of contractual obligations. So I think governments in the last, say, 20 or 30 years have realized that they can have more going on in their jurisdictions and more can be spent, which is good for the gross domestic product, simply by borrowing, but indirectly through a contractual agreement. Now, those contractual agreements with BC Hydro are secret. Gordon Campbell made them secret. We had the one occasion where there was a proposal to do a generation facility using natural gas at Vancouver Island, Duke Point. And that one was, the whole contract was available to the interveners and the public. Well, I did the calculations and did look at the numbers that they had in that contract. And for the day one that they had just the day one of start of operations, they had, by their own representations, $300 million of capital invested. But the present value of that contract, given all the terms of it, going out 25 years, The present value at that time was double.
Can I interrupt you that there was a lot in there? So just so I don't get lost. You said that the contractual obligations with BC Hydro, it's a way to get around going into debt. At the end of the day, the provincial government has to take out a loan to pay these contractual obligations, doesn't it?
Well, it won't be the provincial government. It'll be BC Hydro customers that'll have to pay those.
Okay, if my puny brain understands what you're saying, is they're offloading that onto the customers? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And can you give me like what would be an example for the audience? Would it be that like a green like a green requirement that makes it more expensive and then the customers are obligated to pay that?
Well, there's different ways of spinning it. It could be that, you could say, well, in the interest of saving the planet, we're going to have to increase our bill that you're going to have to pay by 50% or whatever. Yeah.
Or how about this? I'm just going to make a random example. Rather than the government going and hiring people to sweep the streets, which is they would have to get a loan for, they pass a law that says every business has to have one sidewalk sweeper per law, and then that would increase their costs.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's changing who just changes the way it's paid. That's all. So added to this, and it's worth mentioning because most people are unaware, when Bush Light was the president of the United States in his outgoing period, he, along with others in the United States, um, came together with the idea that all of North America should be integrated for electricity. So they call it a North American Reliability Corporation or whatever. But the thing is, it's centered in the United States. And so by design, it's really in service of the United States. Now, in Canada, when that was brought into effect, that NERC was taken into effect, because we're independent provinces in the area of energy, electricity, they had to go to each province and have each province agree to become a member of NERC. And that was Stephen Harper. And basically now they're all that. The pitch to make everybody feel good about becoming that was that then that will make it easier for all of Canada to sell surplus electricity into the United States. But the control that NERC has is only at the wholesale level, and they do have control at the wholesale level under the agreement that Canada's provinces signed on to. The electricity transactions in North America now are sort of kind of blended, and you can't really know if what BC Hydro is asking us to pay is for the benefit of us or the benefit of someone else, just because of that blurring of the lines brought about by the formation of NERC. That is one example where integration of all North America into one unit has taken place. It's not an example of something that's out there to be done. It's been in place for, I think, about 10 or so years. Now, one of the things that prompted that was the bad behavior of Enron in California. and Enron behaved in a way that was just unbelievably bad. They organized the producers, BC Hydro was one of them, into a series of imaginary shutdowns so they could then say there's a shortage and we got to jack up the price to Californians. And they did. And it was really bad. And I'm ashamed to say that BC Hydro willingly participated in it because they were making tons of extra money by doing so. Uh, it was I knew one of the directors and he wouldn't talk to me after I asked him about it. He was so embarrassed. But it was so bad. So, it was definitely a against the law. California went to the law, and they closed that down, basically ended that company in the United States. Enron went bankrupt and out of business. And a few people had to pay some restitution, and BC Hydro was one. But they don't want to talk about it, of course, because it was it was something I was ever so ashamed of being in this province and a part of that.
I have a question about BC Hydro. What is it? Is it a private corporation, a crown corporation?
Crown.
And a crown corporation. So if it makes, for example, $1 billion profit in 1 year, does that come back as a transfer to every citizen of the resident of the province?
No, I don't think so. It it might. I forget whether they transferred any of their excesses. I think they might have in that period of the Enron period to the provincial treasury, but I don't know if I haven't got an example in my mind I can give you. But it wouldn't surprise me.
The reason I ask is you said that it was good for BC Hydro, what the scheme Enron was going along with because it made money for BC Hydro. But where, like that money, does it go to the executive leadership of BC Hydro?
No, no. It would be kept inside of the BC Hydro and or dividend to the province.
Right. So then the province would have access to that to increase services.
Maybe, yeah. But
Uh,
but the issue goes a little further in the case of BC Hydro. Under provincial legislation, all crown corporations are supposed to deliver an annual financial audited report, annual report. And in 2016, they stopped doing it with BC Hydro, and they used the governor, lieutenant governor general, as a way they asked for dispensation, and they get it. So now, since 2016, they no longer produce an official annual report. Now, an annual report in some places, and I think here, is supposed to carry certain legal weight and have accountability issues inside it. So the people who sign it actually are signing and have been on the legal hook for that. And I think they felt uncomfortable in 2016 with that kind of obligation, accountability legally. They changed and they now no longer produce an annual report. They produce a service plan, but it still has a component which is an independent auditor's report goes with it. But that is just one small example of the destruction of the safeguards that were built over the years into our financial system, where people wanted to be there, they were also accountable. And it's represented in Ottawa as deferred agreements, deferred prosecution agreements, which is what Enron got. That the government was told that the law applied, but it was inconvenient politically and for the company to have that, so they got a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, if you look across the landscape, financial landscape in North America, there every now and then you'll see something is deferred, which is another way of saying they avoided accountability under what was the law.
I'm just trying to understand this. The law says that every year you have to give BC Hydro has to give an annual report, financial report. And then 2016, they decide that they're not going to do that. Who's like what is the law anymore? Like to the average person, the law is whatever's written on the books, but it seems it's like the government in power, whatever they decide to enforce becomes the law.
Well, I brought up the term deferred prosecution agreement as an evidence of just what you said. It's not a speculation, it's a fact. In the case, this was for SNC Lavalin, because they were caught using money to bribe to get contracts. And that is unlawful. In old law, it's unlawful. So they had to find a way of avoiding that accountability, and that's where you get the term deferred prosecution agreement.
What about the argument that the prosecutor has discretion? So if they're overloaded with cases, they can decide what to take on. Is that
No,
true?
no. It's either unlawful in law or it's not. So, there is a law in Canada which applies to combines, the anti-combines legislation. And I had a brief exposure to that when I was doing my final year, my first degree. And that was with freight forwarders in Canada. And it was found that they had colluded to increase the power that they had in charging rates for freight forwarding, um, and they had to pay fines and discontinue that practice. So there is legislation, both in Canada and the United States, against that kind of thing. But it doesn't necessarily always it isn't always practiced. And so one example of that would be the recent approval to allow the concentration of television communications that allowed Rogers to buy Shaw out. The Anti-Combines Board said no, but they were overruled by the politicians.
When you say the politicians, that like I'm using the phrase the government,
Correct.
right? So it's almost like you have the will of the people, or what we've accumulated over the years, we call that the law. And then every 4 years you get an election, you get the politicians that they decide They're not supposed to, but sometimes they decide how to enforce that law.
Yes, depends on the what circumstances they're confronted with, and also are there conflicts of interest? Conflicts of interest are not always disclosed, but there is a lot of conflict of interest all over the place in any economy. Everybody doesn't play by a certain set of honest rules. They play a little on the other side of the fence. So, and then they get themselves in trouble and they have to be bailed out, or at least they want to be bailed out. And then you start to get all sorts of conflicts of interest that are suppressed. You will never see them, unlikely never see them, but they're there.
I'm basically I'm picking your brain now, sir. But let's go back to SNC Lavalin.
Yeah.
For the audience, can you tell us what roughly happened and what you believe, what was wrong about it, what should have happened?
Well, SNC Level were caught. So it wasn't a speculation. It was they were caught bribing for getting contracts somewhere, I think in the Mid East. But they're based in Montreal, so they're a Canadian corporation. They're supposed to operate under Canadian law. Whether they have businesses elsewhere, it's immaterial. Um, it's a bit like what happened with Airbus and Hans Schreiber, who was in Canada for the specific purpose of bribing people like me to buy Airbus at a time when the best choice that I was working on was Boeing. We were in looking at Boeing 767s. The president of PWA at that time didn't like it because I said, "This is this is an airplane that's too big, doesn't suit our network, um, and in transportation language, it was the wrong gauge. Gauge is just a quick term to tell people that the person you're talking to that you're way out of line. Boeing 747s were classic, way out of line. Uh, Airbus 390s were a classic, way out of line. And they had to discover it painfully. So in the case of Airbus in the 390s, their production plan was all geared to a production run of 2,500 ships. In the end, they sold about 20, and they sold them to the people who didn't have much choice. They had to buy them, Air France and Lufthansa. It's, I was sitting in a room in Oxford, England. We were taking advice from various people in the airline industry. It was a good course put on by the British Society of whatever. And I couldn't believe they asked us at one point if we could help them. And I'm just a little guy. If we could help them figure out where there might be a use for a supersonic SST. And I said, well, you're probably thinking about transoceanic because that's about the only place you can run one of those. And the guy sitting beside me was from Cathay Pacific, and he was then operating out of Tokyo because they had operations from Hong Kong to Tokyo. And he said, "Oh, I can't think of one." And Peter, he was a good mind. He But he said, I can't think of one. And that is just to illustrate how wrong people become. They grab onto an idea that sounds great, big idea, everybody's going to make millions. And then they try to execute and put into operation. Doesn't work. It's way out of line. So in the case of PWA, I told the president we were wrong getting the 767, but he wanted to spend the money. He had a $200 million waiting for him at the Bank of Commerce. And I said, okay, this is the best airplane of all the bunch that you want to look at right now. And we got rid of any approaches from Airbus because we knew they had not even a close chance at that time. But then we got the airplane in and they found they couldn't operate it in a number of places because it was too big. So they had to sell them all, buy them, and then sell them all. And I went to all that what work for nothing. They made money, of course, in resale because the airplane was in demand for transcontinental work. But these are just metaphors to illustrate what humans do. They get ideas that grand will solve everything they can imagine needing solving. And grand doesn't always solve the issue. It's usually nuts and bolts that solve the issue. Uh, I don't know what it is with humans. I could go on the internet and I could pull up a whole bunch of shots of people standing in front of 747s. The reason why they have a photo op in front of a 747 was at that time, it defined success in their minds, the people standing in front. Well, I went around the globe talking to various 747-100 operators, and the one that was most truthful was Swissair. So I said, how many revenue hours a year do you get from your 747 airplane? And they honestly admitted to me they got about 1,500. Well, 1,500 is about 30% of the revenue hours you need to pay for all that capital and operating costs to be successful. So people with 747s went out of business. Pan Am went out of business.
It's an interesting view of taking an accountant's view to business and how it can go bust. Um, Eric, I want to ask you a question about SNC-Lavalin.
Yeah.
What would you say to the argument made by the Prime Minister Trudeau that um, it doesn't make sense to go to after the directors of the company who have already left, and you can pursue them and charge them personally? What would you say to that argument?
Uh, well, I think it always comes down to whether you operate with integrity and honesty or not. If you don't, if you know you don't, then there should be some kind of consequence for that. Because, that the laws are there that say that's what society wants. They want consequences for people breaking the law. And I can't disagree with that. I think that's logical. You can take it to any kind of legal situation at all. One thing you should remember that in Canada, the law is practiced as mostly as English law, except Quebec, which is French law. The difference between the two of them is that English law relies on mostly on precedent. So the practice of English law is about learning all the precedences and then applying them. It's sort of like formula kind of law. Whereas French law, Roman law, Scottish law is about the evidence in every case. And the reason I can tell you that, I asked a Supreme Court judge about that question, and he gave me the answer.
What was the answer?
Just what I said.
Oh, he explained it for
All of
you.
Canada is practicing precedent law, and Quebec only is practicing what I call Scottish law, French law, Roman law.
Which one do you prefer? I look at common law, and it seems like a good idea because it's like layers on an oyster pearl, and you perfect it over time. But you get to a point where there's just so much case law that ordinary people can't understand how the law works
Well,
anymore.
that's on purpose, don't you think?
I do, but my views are a little bit more radical. I want to get your view.
Well, I call it lazy law. Precedent law is something I call lazy law because a person practicing, all they have to do is learn the precedents. I mean, I had a personal confrontation with Revenue Canada a few years back on an issue of taxation. And the lawyer that was representing Revenue Canada is foolish enough to put in a letter that I had in front of me that that I didn't fit within precedent. So I went to the court and sat in front of the judge and I said, this is what I have. This lawyer has written this, and there it is in black and white. And I also know in black and white that the justice system in Canada um, practices fairness because it's in black and white. And I won in that particular case because the lawyer for Revenue Canada was foolish enough to say that fairness wasn't part of their law. No, it's important. That's an important thing, you know. I mean, a few times along the way, one particular case, the federal government, Trudeau Senior, wanted to impose a French language requirement on PWA for announcements in the cabin of the airplane. And so I went back to the original legislation, and sure enough, in there, the legislators had anticipated this issue and put in a statement saying that where there was no commercial value or sense in doing so, it wasn't a requirement. Well, I had the about 6 or 7 lawyers in Ottawa turning everything upside down to try and run over me. But in the end, I won. People are always trying to twist things to suit a personal preference or something they've been told they have to do. And so that's when it becomes a matter of how you behave as a person. Do you is your obligation to humanity or is it to your boss? Which comes first and always first?
Sorry, I got puppies in the background. I'm muting it. To your point, bringing up Trudeau, the senior. What's your opinion, if you have any, on the changes he made to the Bank of Canada in 74, basically changing it so we're not really getting interest-free loans anymore? Do you have an opinion on that?
Uh, Not really. No.
That was easy. What about NAFTA? Like, what's your view? Do you think that was positive for Canada or negative?
North American free trade. Well, um, to be part of NAFTA meant that we had to give up sovereignty in some ways and would have to. And I'm not a fan of losing personal or national sovereignty. So, in my view, NAFTA was going to be a compromise of that and is a compromise.
So I guess some good parts, some bad parts.
Yeah, I think there was good intentions. There was to try and integrate a lot of the manufacturing went on in eastern and central Canada with the manufacturing and so on that went on in the United States. And I suppose, there's been benefits. We've participated in their economy and they in ours. So
Um, Eric, I guess I have one final question. We had a super structured show, but we never actually adhered to the slides.
sorry.
No, it's
Sorry.
fine. You're such a like an organic speaker. I just let you go with it. My what there was one thing we talked about was the use of taxes to serve the rich in Canada. Can you
Yeah.
flesh that out for us, please?
Well, in formal terms, there's two models of taxation, and this is a formal term now. One is regressive, and the other term is progressive. Regressive does not recognize the ability of the individual or the corporation or the business to pay. There's no recognition of their ability to pay. It's like all sizes, it's a shoe for all sizes. Whereas progressive taxation recognizes the ability of an individual or business to pay. Now, that progressive taxation is built into our income tax system. And that's an example of progressive taxation. Uh, Regressive taxation is things like property taxation, uh, fuel taxation. So, in times of hardship, like we have in certain parts of the economy right now, the regressive model is really hurting. And in fact, in the case of property taxes, it's causing excessive hardship to the point of you have homelessness growing. In the United States, they have a term for that. It's called, where things get really bad, it's called deaths of despair. And they don't, the politicians are really reluctant to follow that deaths of despair in its logical way to come to a point where where they can make a difference to help diminish that. Because over the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 5, whatever years, the deaths by despair have been increasing at an alarming rate. And that would encompass a concept of homelessness. It would encompass a concept of being addicted to various kinds of narcotics and liquor. Um, so, for the audience's sake, I think it's important to understand the two kinds of taxation. because I've tried that on the provincial premier and there's been no reply. So it's clear that he doesn't, he or whoever's writing for him doesn't want to go into a conversation where they talk about a taxation model that reflects the ability to pay. And where you get that demarcation of concepts more played out, obviously, is in a rural situation versus an urban situation. Because the life in urban situations is more defined of having people do for you, whereas in a rural situation is a place where people do for themselves more. Uh, and I think that that is regressive taxation is an enemy of the people in Canada because of the way our country is set up, the divided populations strewn all around. And there's a lot of challenges for that, from that.
So I know I said that was the last question, but I have a follow-up one. Last one. You brought up this concept. I agree with you, the rural urban sort of differences, but this concept of the financialization of our economy or the fact that we have two parallel economies, can you explain that for us, please?
Uh, well, if a good way of trying to explain it is by looking at outcomes. So if you look at the outcome in the last 10 years of, say, a shareholder of a bank as a metaphor for the financial sector, shareholders of the banks, Canada, have seen a doubling of their share prices, a doubling of their incomes from dividends. Now, that's through a pandemic period, last 10 years. Whereas if you looked at the real economy, you can see challenges of insolvency in businesses. Um, I know my old airline industry, for a year and a half or 2 years, they had lost something like 80 to 90% of their traffic, their business, their revenue. You got to see that that was a huge challenge financially for that industry. And as a metaphor for a lot of the industries in Canada, the mainstream industries. So it's like the economy is separated into two parts. One part goes along very nicely, thank you very much. And another part of the economy, which is beholden to the first part by contracts and all that stuff, has borne all the bumps and uglies along the way. It's not been nice. But since you want to talk about the differences, it's also manifested in the price of commodities. And the most dramatic example of that is the price of gold. In the last 5 years, it's gone from US dollars, say 1,200 an ounce. So the measure of an ounce is fixed. That's a fixed thing. The variable is how much per ounce. Today, it's about 26 something or other US dollars. So there's two ways of looking at that. One is there's a lot of demand for gold. I think there probably is. But one other way is that the value of the US Canadian dollar have decreased by 50%, which is typically what has happened when governments have resorted to overproducing their currency. They do it now by a mouse clip. You got a million here, a million there, or you do it by increasing the number of pieces of paper you put out, which have an intrinsic value of zero. And you do it by borrowing, of course, and you go into deficits like we are. All those things combined tend to cripple the value in the open world of your piece of paper. And that, I think, is where the inflation is coming from. It's not coming from somebody getting together and combining to raise prices like OPEC did. It's to do with the devaluation of the power of the currencies, which is a central government issue.
And I actually just read the email you sent around on that issue of the price of gold, and I didn't know that Hayek after World War II recommended a decentralized basket of goods based reserve currency.
Oh yeah. Yeah, von Hayek, yeah. He was of the Austrian School of Economics, but he moved, I think, during the Second World War, of course, and became an economist in England. And he was commissioned to prepare a report on the issue of a reserve, world reserve currency after the Second World War. And he wrote two volumes, Good Money 1 and 2. I don't know where they exist. I got mine from Berkeley University in on loan in California, and maybe the von Mises Institute in America would have a copy. I don't know, but you're right. The recommendation was a basket of non-perishable commodities that could be used to provide the wealth of individual countries on which they could then base their currencies. Um, that was vetoed by the United States. They wanted the reserve currency for themselves. So, of course, that went by the boards. But the beauty of Hayek's suggestion, I thought, was that he didn't restrict his qualifying commodities to gold and silver, which are the traditional ones. He expanded it so that a broader population of the world had a chance to participate. You didn't have to be a place that had gold mines. You know, you could have something else like potash or iron ore. You know, just it brought all of humanity into a position where there's a likelihood that they all could participate in that system because they had access to those kinds of resources themselves.
I guess we're kind of seeing that now with the BRICS nations.
Yeah.
Um, Mr. Anderson, I guess we're at the end of the episode. I don't know, do you have I believe you're not really big on social media, but do you have like a newsletter or anything anybody can follow you?
No,
No? All right.
no. The only public place I've been publishing anything is that Dialogue, which is a small publisher here in Nanaimo. They send out about once every 3 or 4 months something. It's about discussions of various things.
Well,
I
you never
used
know.
I used to work with Rafe Mayer, but of course, since he's passed on, that's ended.
I was gonna say,
You're a new Rafe Mayer.
you never know, but I don't think I'm that good. Um, but if anyone in the audience sees you on the street, maybe they'll say hi.
Oh, that'd be
Uh,
nice. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's been fun. Good to meet you.
Likewise, and Mr. Anderson, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, it's been fun. And it's Erik, by the way.
All right, Eric, have a wonderful day.
Cheers.
Bye.